This podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's new Patreon community, the Global Coffee Think Tank. Check the show notes or head to patreon.com/MapperForward to find out how you can become a member today. Welcome back to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. This is our final episode of our 5-episode series with Matt McCormack, cybersecurity expert, and we are talking about today, if you happen to get hacked, if you happen to get compromised, what do we do, Matt?
So if you are an individual or a company in Australia, for example, and you get compromised, there are resources, cyber.gov.au, the ACSC, or the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, is the outreach arm of the
Outreach works.
ASD. Yeah. The outreach arm of the ASD, which is our the Australian equivalent of the NSA, for lack of a better comparison. So that is the kind of public outreach arm trying to help businesses and individuals get secure. Mm-hmm. So they've got so much information. There's you can look up the ASD top 10 or the top 4. They keep changing it, but about what you can do as a business to try to stay secure. And a lot of what I've covered is going to be covered there.
Okay. Links in the show notes, folks.
Yeah. So, and for larger companies, there's, you can get more and more elaborate kind of defenses, depending on how big of a target you have on your back. And that's usually a function of how much money you're making. But if you, as an individual, I would say, have a look at cyber.gov.au, and there's lots of resources there. They want you to report it. But sort of functionally what you can do, let's say that where possible, start changing passwords, get a password manager, and then use that to change your passwords, enable two-factor where possible. Email is kind of critical, and I think potentially overlooked to a lot of people, because that's where your password resets go to your email address, right? So if someone has access to your email, then they can just start resetting passwords on everything else, then because you've got the email as authentication, right? So assuming they haven't nabbed your phone, then the other way is email. So let's make sure that you have your two-factor on your email and a password on the email that is not used by anything else. Again, password reuse, the whole thing. And those are the main things. I mean, once you start going through and changing your passwords, you might want to cancel credit card or call your bank and tell them to, try and reverse this transaction or something like that. But unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do once it happens. So we just really want to make sure that to avoid it happening. Chances are like there's not the resources for people to go tracking down typically the perpetrators. They may be known to certain organizations or companies, but you're not going to get your money back. It's just not going to happen. So really need to try and avoid it happening in the first place by putting some of the stuff in place that we talked about. And as we talked about, sorry, you go.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, and as we talked about, right? So there's the stuff you can do. There's stuff within your control, but then there's the stuff kind of outside of your control, right? There's these flow-on effects of what happens, right? So if you get compromised, then they've got lists of your like we talked about, your vendors or your customers and all this stuff, and all the flow-on effects there, right? I mean, it becomes difficult to contain the breach.
And as the world gets a little bit more tense, I'm being very diplomatic with my terminology there, but as particularly in the coffee industry, as our supply chain gets more tense, and we start to witness a lot more vulnerabilities in getting access to coffee, in the way that coffee is traded. I see the opportunity there for cyber criminals to kind of hijack those vulnerabilities and use those in their favor. For example, what's happening right now is that it's expected that the yield of coffee is going to drop over the next couple of years because of the increased price of fertilizers, because of the war in Ukraine and Russia. Now, if the demand for coffee remains the same, but the supply is significantly diminished, which is what the anticipation is going to be. Suppliers are going to change the way that they require payment. Usually what was happening was that you can pay as you use the stock. So if a supplier is bringing coffee into the country, as you draw down from the supply that you've asked to be allocated to them, you pay for what you draw down on. It's already starting to shift that suppliers want you to pay for the full allocation before it leaves the origin or as it arrives into the origin country. And so if if the payment terms and the way that people are asking you to take payment for things are becoming more competitive, so it's the people who have the willingness to pay up front and the ability to pay up front, they have greater access to capital, and they know that if they don't, they're going to lose access to that green coffee. I don't see why that wouldn't be an opportunity. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars here. So I don't see why that wouldn't open up a vulnerability in the coffee supply chain. And I think it's just important for us to have an understanding of what we would do if something was a little bit off with regards to those new payment requirements from suppliers.
It's a good point, and adds more pressure. If and when this stuff starts to happen and the flow-on effects start to be felt by the industry, people are going to be a little bit probably more stressed and maybe second guess their better judgment when it comes to what in a time when they were not stressed, making some decisions around either accepting, for example, some social engineering that purports to get them a whole bunch of money or an invoice or something like that. I think it's when you're under stress, you're not thinking properly, and it sounds like that the industry is various parts of that entire supply chain probably going to be looking at a bit of stress soon.
And let's be real, we deal with a lot of third world countries. So when, let's say, the opportunity comes up where you want to buy from, a particular country that uses certain payment systems, Western Union and those kinds of payment systems, not to say that they're not secure, but what happens if somebody tricks you into sending them money for coffee that they're producing, or, they want payment up front for a special processing method that you're going to be doing, and somehow somebody comes in, socially engineers you to send them the money up front, and they weren't the person that you thought that they were. There's a lot of opportunities there for the exposure, and it all comes back to this kind of idea of goodwill. People operate in the coffee industry under the pretense of, but everybody looks after everybody else and nobody tricks anybody else. That's such horseshit. I mean, it's business.
There's people from outside the industry who are doing this, right? And they are going to be, masquerading as someone from within the industry. So absolutely. And I think, and it's just important. I think, and you've tried to emphasize by having this series of podcasts is that it is something people need to worry about. Not, you don't have to lose sleep over it, but at least put the basics in place, as we've discussed, because the headache of dealing with it, if it does happen, is just it's just too much. Like it's something you don't want to deal with. You shouldn't have to deal with it. Massive flow-on effects, either financially, or your reputation, right? I mean, as a larger, let's say, a medium to large size company, and it's disclosed that you were hacked, it's your reputation that's on the line, and people might go to your competitor instead, right? You might
think twice about doing business with
business
you again
over time, right? And it's because if they know that that their details weren't safe, right? And we've talked about before, like anyone listening to this could put in all their email addresses to this Have I Been Pwned website, for example, and just see how many breaches they've been a part of. If you reuse passwords, your username and password, your email address and password is on the internet now for people to use, just statistically. I'm pretty happy to say that. So So, and that's just like that's one way that people are going to use. So let's hope it doesn't happen to people. But a little bit of basic hygiene, we talked about 80-20 before, doing the important 20% and get 80% of the value, is really what we're trying to do here, because, unless you're a big business kind of spending a lot of time and effort and thinking about this and staying up at night worrying about it, it's probably, you're just replacing one stress with another. We don't want that. We just want people to be
aware
as protected as
and
possible.
Diligent, but not obsessive.
Yeah, that's right.
Great. Matt, thank you so much for your time. I know that we've gone over time, but thank you. It's really valuable information. There'll be some coffee coming your way. 100%.
Oh, good.
So the show notes will have the websites for each of these episodes we spoke about. We'll put them in there. And like we said, everyone just kind of get a little bit informed and figure out how you're going to take care of things. All right. Thank you, Mr. McCormack. You are a gem.
Very welcome.
Peace, love, and peanut butter, everybody. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks, friends. If you enjoyed this video, here's what you should check out next. Consider supporting Map It Forward on Patreon and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell before you leave.